Why did Queen Elizabeth I have an entire age named after her?
Ascending the throne in 1558, Queen Elizabeth, 1533–1603, remained in power until 1603, a 45-year period during which England dominated the seas to become a European power. Colonization began. With Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554–1618, and others establishing British settlements in North America. Culture flourished, with the likes of William Shakespeare, 1564–1616, Christopher Marlowe, 1564–1593. And Sir Edmund Spenser, 1552–1599, producing literary masterpieces, and industry and commerce boomed. This was the Elizabethan age, one of England's high water marks. One of the most well-known events of Elizabeth's reign was England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in July–August 1588. This event has an interesting twist. The only child of Henry VIII, 1491–1547, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, c. 1507–1536, Elizabeth had succeeded her half-sister Mary Tudor, 1516–58, as queen. In the summer of 1588, the invincible Spanish fleet, which was headed for invasion of England, had been dispatched by none other than Spain's Philip II, 1527–1598, Mary Tudor's former husband. Though the English were severely outnumbered, having only 34 ships to Spain's 132, they were aided by weather and defeated the Spanish Armada on August 8. This victory at sea opened the world to English trade and colonization. Queen Elizabeth was the last of the Tudor rulers who are credited with strengthening the monarchy in England. They were succeeded by the House of Stuart in 1603, when James I, 1566–1625, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, ascended the throne. It is that James who gave the world the King James Version of the Bible. He is also notable for having been the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. 1542–1587, whom Elizabeth I had reluctantly put to death.
Why did so many Americans protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War?
The Vietnam War, 1954–75, divided the American public. The anti-war movement maintained that the conflict in Southeast Asia did not pose a risk to U.S. security, contrary to the domino effect that Washington, D.C. foresaw. And in the absence of a threat to national security, protesters wondered, what are we fighting for? Meanwhile, President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1908–1973, slowly stepped up the number of troops sent to Vietnam. Many never came home, and those who did came home changed. Mass protests were held, including the hallmark of the era, the sit-in Protesters accused the U.S. government of not only involving Americans in a conflict in which the country had no part, but of supporting a corrupt, unpopular and undemocratic government in South Vietnam. Those Americans who supported the nation's fight against communism eventually became frustrated by the United States' inability to achieve a decisive victory in Vietnam. Even for the so-called hawks, who supported the war, the mounting costs of the war hit home when President Johnson requested new taxes. As the casualty count soared, public approval of U.S. participation in Vietnam dropped. By the end of the 1960s, under increasing public pressure, the government began to withdraw American troops from Vietnam. The evacuation of the ground troops was not complete until 1973. But even then, soldiers who were missing in action, MIAs, and prisoners of war, POWs, were left behind.
Who were the most important rulers of the Roman Empire?
The 500 years of the Roman Empire, 27 C to AD 476, gave history some of its most noteworthy and most diabolical leaders. The major emperors are names that are familiar to most every student of Western civilization: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Diocletian, and Constantine I, called the Great. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero were the first 5 emperors. A succession covering 75 years of Roman rule. Octavian, 63 BC-A.D. 14, later known as Augustus, became Roman emperor when, after the assassination of his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, a power struggle ensued and he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra to take the throne. Under Augustus's rule, from 27 BC to AD 14 began the 200 years of the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace. During this time no power emerged that was strong enough to sustain conflict with the Roman army. Consequently, Rome was able to turn its attention to the arts, literature, education, and trade. As second emperor of Rome, Tiberius, 42 BC-A.D. 37, came under the influence of Roman politician and conspirator Sejanus. AD 31. Tiberius was the adopted son of Emperor Augustus. And though he had been carefully schooled and groomed to take on the leadership role, ultimately he became a tyrannical ruler. The final years of his reign were marked by viciousness and cruelty. Upon Tiberius's death, his nephew Caligula, AD 12-41, ascended the throne. Born Gaius Caesar, he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots, since he was brought up in military camps and at an early age had been dressed as a soldier. For a short time Caligula ruled with moderation. But not long after he came to power, he fell ill and thereafter exhibited the erratic behavior for which he is well known. Most scholars agree that Caligula must have been crazy. He was murdered in AD 41, and Claudius, also nephew to Tiberius, was then proclaimed emperor. Claudius. 10b.ca.d 54, renewed the expansion of Rome, waging battle with Germany, Syria, and Mauritania, present-day Algeria and Morocco, and conquering half of Britain. Though his administration was reportedly well run, he had his enemies, among them was his niece Agrippina the Younger, AD 1559, who is believed to have murdered him in 54, after securing her son. Nero, as successor to the throne. In Nero, AD 37–68, the early Roman Empire had perhaps its most despotic ruler. Though his early years in power were marked by the efficient conduct of public affairs. In 59 he had his mother assassinated. She reportedly had tried to rule through her son. And Nero's legacy from that point forward is one of ruthless behavior. He was involved in murder plots, ordered the deaths of many Romans, instituted the persecution of Christians, and led an extravagant lifestyle that emptied the public coffers. He was declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and in the year 68 took his own life. With the exception of Augustus, the 1st century AD of the Roman Empire was marked by extreme rulers. The 2nd century AD was marked by the leadership of soldiers and statesmen. Trajan, 53–117, who ruled from the year 98 until his death 19 years later, is best known for his military campaigns, which expanded Rome's territory. He was also a builder constructing bridges, roads, and many buildings. When Marcus Aurelius, 121–80, ascended to emperor in 161, he had already been in public office for more than 20 years. A man of great experience, he was reportedly both learned and of gentle character. His generals put down revolting tribes, and, in addition to winning victories along the Danube River, his troops also fought barbarians in the north.
How did the Aztec and Inca empires compare with the Mayan?
While all were advanced civilizations that were eventually conquered by Spaniards, the Inca and Aztec cultures reached their peaks in the 15th century just before the arrival of the Europeans in the New World. The Mayan civilization reached its zenith about 500 years earlier, and was already in decline by the time of European incursion. Each group also occupied a different region of the Americas, where each carved out its own stronghold and flourished. The Aztecs settled in central Mexico, the Incas in western South America, primarily Peru, and the Mayas in the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. There is evidence that they traded with each other as well as with American Indians to the north. The Aztecs founded their central city of Tenochtitlan, the site of Mexico City, about 1325. A poor nomadic people before their arrival in Mexico's central region. The Aztecs believed the Lake Texcoco marsh was a prophetic place to settle. Before they built it into a great city, they first had to fill in the swampy area, which they did by creating artificial islands. In the 1500s, when the Spanish first saw the remarkable city with its system of causeways, canals, bridges, and aqueducts, they called it the Venice of the New World. In addition to constructing the impressive trade and cultural center of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were farmers, astronomers, mathematicians, and historians who recorded the events of their civilization. Their religion was pantheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. Given that, it's not surprising that when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, at first the Maya believed they were gods, or at least the heavenly hosts of their long-awaited god Quetzalcoatl, and even welcomed them with gifts. Later, the Aztec rose up against the Europeans, but under the leadership of Hernán Cortés. 1485 to 1547, the Spaniards conquered the group, claiming Mexico in August 1521. The Incas developed one of the most extensive empires in all the Americas. During the 100 years before the arrival of the Europeans, the Incas expanded their territory along the western coast of South America to include parts of present-day Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Though it was a vast region, it was nevertheless a closely knit state ruled by a powerful emperor. The government was subdivided down to the local level. But because the emperor required total obedience from his subjects, local rulers were kept in check. Like the Aztecs in Mexico, the Inca developed an infrastructure that included a network of roads, bridges, and ferries, as well as irrigation systems. They, too, built impressive edifices, demonstrating their abilities as engineers. The magnificent city of Machu Picchu was modeled in clay before construction began. The Inca were also skilled craftspeople, working with gold, silver, and textiles. Like the Aztecs, the Incas worshipped many gods. And when the Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541, arrived in the region in 1532, he was welcomed as a god at first. However, by 1537 the Inca were brought under Spanish control.
Was the Mayan Empire the most advanced early civilization?
In some regards, the Mayas were more advanced than other civilizations. Their development preceded that of the other agrarian civilizations in North and South America, principally the Aztec and the Inca. The Mayas were an agricultural people who in about 1000 BC settled in southern Mexico and Central America. Their territory covered Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, much of Guatemala, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. They developed a civilization that was highly advanced. Not only did the Mayas produce remarkable architecture, including flat-topped pyramids, temples, and towers that are still visited by tourists today, and art, including sculpture, painting, and murals. But they developed their own writing system, probably the first in the Western Hemisphere. They used this system to record time, astronomical events, their history, and religion. They believed in more than 160 gods. They also developed an advanced mathematics as well as a 365-day calendar, believed by some to be even more accurate than the Gregorian calendar in use today. At its peak, the Mayan population numbered some 14 million. Their history is divided into three periods. The pre-classic period began about the time they originated, roughly 1000 BC, and extended into AD 300. This was the group's formative period. During the classic period, 300 to 900, Mayan culture spread throughout the area and city centers were developed at Copan, Honduras, Palenque, Uxmal, and Chichen Itza, Mexico, and Piedras Negras, Yucaxictan, and Tikal, Guatemala. Scholars believe that Tikal was home to some 50,000 people and was not only a center for government, education, economics, and science, but was also a spiritual mecca for the Maya. It was in the second half of the classic period that the Maya made their greatest accomplishments in art and science. Europe would not produce a superior system of mathematics for centuries to come. During the post-classic period, 900-1546, they were invaded by the Toltecs. However, the Maya absorbed these people rather than being conquered by them. Nevertheless, by the time the Spaniards arrived in the mid-1500s, the Mayan civilization was in decline. Some historians attribute this to widespread famine or disease, while others believe the decline was due to a rebellion of the people against the harsh government. Though they were conquered by the Spaniards and became assimilated into the larger culture that developed in the region, Maya Indians still survive in Mexico and Central America today.
What is the Y Accord?
Officially called the Y River Memorandum. The accord outlined a limited and interim land for peace settlement between Israel and Palestine. It was signed October 23, 1998, by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, 1949, and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, 1929-2004, at a summit held at Y Mills, on the banks of Maryland's Y River. The meeting was the follow-up to the 1993 Middle East Summit in Oslo, Norway. There, after months of talks, both sides agreed to an interim framework of Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Y meeting was the opportunity for both sides to make good on the promises made in Oslo. The Y Accord was brokered after a 21-hour bargaining session mediated by U.S. President Bill Clinton. 1946. The points of the agreement included developing a security plan to crack down on terrorism, the withdrawal of Israeli troops from an additional 13% of the West Bank, along with a commitment for future additional withdrawals, a transfer of roughly 14% of the West Bank from joint Israeli-Palestinian control to Palestinian control. Palestinian agreement that anti-Israeli clauses in its national charter would be removed. Israel's guarantee that it would provide 2 corridors of safe passage between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Israeli release of 750 Palestinian prisoners, and the opening of a Palestinian airport in Gaza. The Knesset, Israel's parliament, approved the accords on November 17, 1998. But by December, Israel suspended its obligations in the Y, citing Palestinian failure to comply with the accords. Benjamin Netanyahu's successor, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, 1942. Pledged to resume implementing the Y Accord but at the same time delayed its timetable, saying the measures should be included in a final peace agreement with the Palestinians. On September 4, 1999, the two sides met again at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where they agreed on a new timetable for the Y. That document was signed by Barak and the Palestinian Authority's Arafat and was witnessed by diplomats from Egypt, Jordan, and the United States, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. But both Barak and Arafat faced mounting political opposition at home, posing immediate challenges to the revised agreement, which stalled again.
Why did some observers draw comparisons between the war in Iraq and the Vietnam War?
Critics of the U.S.-led war in Iraq found several similarities to American military involvement in Vietnam. Both conflicts seemed to many people to be without ample cause. Critics of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq charged that there was no compelling reason for Americans to go to war in the Middle Eastern nation. They called the operation hawkish, saying it was an unwarranted expansion of the war on terror. These arguments were strengthened when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. Media images of protests against the invasion of Iraq harkened back to the anti-war demonstrations of the Vietnam era. And, like Vietnam, there seemed to be no clear exit strategy for the U.S. military from Iraq. These were extended operations, or wars without end. Some observers also drew comparisons between Vietnam's My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq. They pointed to military spokespersons who categorized the atrocities as isolated events, unrepresentative of American military policy. The Bush administration stood by the decision to enter Iraq, ousting and capturing Saddam Hussein, 1937. Saying it was a rogue state led by a despotic ruler who had the capability of aiding terrorist groups. The controversy over Iraq continued long after President George W. Bush, 1946, declared the end to major combat operations, as the casualty count climbed, the result of continued coalition fighting against pockets of resistance and attacks on U.S. installments in the unstable nation. In 2005, as U.S. officials slowly handed over security to Iraqi forces, there was not yet a timetable for U.S. withdrawal. But the newly elected interim president, Kurdish leader Jalal Talabani, vowed that his government would work to provide security so that U.S.-led coalition forces could return home.
What is the Intifada?
Intifada means uprising in Arabic and refers specifically to two recent periods of intense and regular violence between Palestinians and Israelis in the disputed territories of the Middle East. The First Intifada began in 1987 and did not subside until a peace settlement was brokered between the two sides in Oslo, Norway, in 1993. The Second Intifada began in September 2000. The violence of that uprising continued into 2005 despite ceasefire vows from Arab, Palestinian and Israeli leaders. The second wave of violence was marked by almost daily suicide bombings of Israeli targets, including markets, restaurants, buses, and other public places. Israelis view the intifadas as acts of terrorism, claiming the lives of thousands of Israeli citizens. Palestinians in general and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the militant Islamic group Hamas in particular consider the tactics part of their war of national liberation, a decades-long struggle to establish an autonomous Palestinian homeland in Israel. In the waves of violence, casualties were high on both sides. More than 4,000 died in the Second Intifada alone. The cycle of conflict appeared endless. Palestinian acts of violence were met with retaliation from the Israelis, which incited further violence from the Palestinians. Hopes for a lasting peace were raised again in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, 1935, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, 1928, held a summit meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. They declared a ceasefire agreement and their intentions to resume negotiations, as outlined in the Roadmap for Peace. But the militant Palestinian group Hamas immediately claimed the verbal agreement was non-binding. Indeed, Hamas, which was largely responsible for the Intifada, posed major roadblocks to an end of violence in the region. Before they would put down arms, the group demanded total Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Hamas was also dissatisfied with Israel's agreement to release only 900 of the 8,000 Palestinians held prisoner by Israel.
Why was Julius Caesar murdered?
The Roman general and statesman Julius Caesar, 100–44 B.C., was stabbed to death in the Senate house by a group of men, including some of his former friends, who viewed him as an ambitious tyrant and a threat to the Roman Republic. The date of the assassination, March 15, fell into relatively common usage thanks to William Shakespeare's tragedy Julius Caesar, written in the late 1590s, which has a soothsayer warning the Roman general to beware the Ides of March. After Caesar's death in 44 BC, a triumvirate was formed to rule Rome, with Lepidus, Octavian, who would in 27 BC become Augustus, the Roman Empire's first ruler, and Mark Antony sharing power. It was Mark Antony, c. 83–30 BC. Of Antony and Cleopatra of fame, who aroused the mobs against Caesar's conspirators, driving them out of Rome. The events illustrate the controversy about Julius Caesar. While some clearly viewed him as a demagogue who forced his way into power, others considered the patrician-born Caesar a man of noble character who defended the rights of the people in an oligarchic state where the government was controlled by a few people who had only their own interests in mind. This divided opinion has followed Caesar throughout history. While opinion is still divided on what kind of a ruler Caesar was, there can be no denying his contributions both to Rome, which would soon emerge as the Roman Empire, and to modern civilization. In his battles, Caesar brought the provinces of Italy under control and defeated his former co-ruler, Pompey the Great, who had, along with Caesar and Crassus, formed the first triumvirate, effectively ending the oligarchy that had ruled Rome. In so doing, he had succeeded in ending the disorder that had plagued Rome for decades and laid the groundwork for the formation of the empire under his grandnephew Augustus in 27 BC. While Caesar was in office, he planned and carried out several reforms, not the least of which was the implementation of the Julian calendar, which he introduced in 46 BC. The Gregorian calendar we use today evolved from it. Caesar also left a legacy of literature. He penned a total of 10 books on his battles in Gaul, c. 58–50 BC, and on the Civil War, which he had more or less started in 49 BC. These clear commentaries are still considered masterpieces of military history.
Was King Tut the greatest ruler of ancient Egypt?
No, in fact, King Tut's reign was relatively unimportant in the vast history of ancient Egypt. A ruler of the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun, c. 1370–1352 BC, was in power from age 9, 1361 BC, until his death at the age of 18, a 9-year period that would be of little significance were it not for the November 1922 discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings near ancient Thebes, present-day Luxor. Of the 27 pharaohs buried near Thebes, only the tomb of the minor king, Tutankhamun, was spared looting through the ages. Having not been opened since ancient times, the tomb still contained its treasures. In the antechamber, English archaeologist Howard Carter, 1873–1939, found more than 600 artifacts, including funerary bouquets, sandals, robes, cups and jars, a painted casket, life-size wooden statues of Tutankhamun, animal-sided couches, remnants of chariots, and a golden throne. In the burial chambers, a team of archaeologists discovered 4 golden shrines and the golden coffin containing the royal mummy of Tutankhamun, complete with a golden mask covering his head and shoulders. Earlier in his career, Carter had discovered the tombs of King Tut's predecessors, Queen Hatshepsut, c. 1520–c. 1468 BC, and King Thutmose IV. d. 1417 BC, both of whom were also rulers during Egypt's 18th dynasty.
What was the Bill of Rights of 1689?
The English Bill, accepted by King William III, 1650–1702. Who ruled jointly with his Protestant wife Queen Mary II, 1662–1694, seriously limited royal power. After a struggle between the Stuart kings and Parliament and the subsequent ousting of King James II, 1633–1701, Parliament presented the Bill of Rights to King William and Queen Mary as a condition of their accession. The document not only described certain civil and political rights and liberties as true, ancient, and indubitable, but it also ironed out how the throne would be succeeded. This point was of critical importance to the future of England. The article stipulated that no Roman Catholic would rule the country. Since the Bill of Rights served to assert the role of Parliament in the government of England, it is considered one of the seminal documents of British constitutional law.
What was the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617–907, was the sixth to last Chinese dynasty. It's well known since the period saw great achievements not only in government and business, but in letters and the arts, principally lyrical poetry, formal prose, painting, sculpture, and porcelain pottery. The first published book, the Diamond Sutra, was produced during this time, in 868. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. As a result, trade prospered, with Chinese jade, porcelain, silk, rice, spices, and teas exported to India, the Middle East, and Europe. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into three main branches. The Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies. The Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored bureaucracy, and the Department of State's Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. Add to this triumvirate a board of censors, which ensured that corruption was kept to a minimum. This form of government outlasted the Tang dynasty. Subsequent monarchies perpetuated the system into the 20th century. Yet another example of the forward thinking of the Tang dynasty was a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles before they took an exam that would qualify them for official duty.
What was the first national government?
It is believed to have been that of the first Egyptian king, Menes, who united Upper and Lower Egypt in 3110 B.C. and founded a central government at Memphis, near present-day Cairo. Ruling for 62 years, Menes established the first of what would eventually number 30 dynasties that ruled ancient Egypt for nearly 3,000 years until 332 BC. By the time the third dynasty began around 2700 BC, the central government was well established, and strong subjects believed their kings and queens to be half human and half god. The pharaohs lived in magnificent luxury. Palaces and temples were built for them and were filled with exotic goods from other lands. These treasures were even buried with the pharaohs in order to be enjoyed in the afterworld. It was during the Third Dynasty that the 500-year period known as the Old Kingdom or the Pyramid Age began. It would become the period that saw the building of gigantic pyramids for Egypt's kings.
What was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal?
News of the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, where Iraqi prisoners were being held by members of the U.S. military during Operation Iraqi Freedom, first surfaced in April 2004 when shocking photographs began appearing in the American media. The photos depicted an array of hideous abuses, all of them in violation of the Geneva Conventions for the Treatment of Prisoners of War. The deep troubles first surfaced in spring 2003 when International Red Cross and human rights groups complained that American troops had been mistreating Iraqi prisoners. The U.S. Army launched an investigation into its prison system. A fact-finding mission was eventually led by Major General Antonio Taguba, who completed his report in February 2004. It stated that one police company at Abu Ghraib had committed sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. The Taguba report also found that supervisory omission was rampant at the prison. More investigations and reports followed, taking into account other prisons under central command. Some of the reports tied prisoner deaths to the abuses. The scandal sent shockwaves around the world and sparked an intense debate about how such abuses could have happened. The tortures were labeled by some as unauthorized actions taken by a few individuals, but others believed they were a manifestation of policy that had gone wrong. The scandal soon widened. By May 2004, British newspapers began reporting abuses by British troops. While Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, apologized for any mistreatment Iraqi prisoners may have suffered at the hands of British troops, President Bush went on Arabic television to denounce the abuses as abhorrent. He stopped short of an apology, saying that the mistreatment does not represent the America that I know. Both nations moved quickly to bring charges against several soldiers shown in the pictures. The guilty verdicts, and subsequent sentences, began being handed down in May 2004. The prison scandals fueled criticism of the controversial war in Iraq. They also prompted a deadly backlash from the Arab world. Insurgents in Iraq began a series of kidnappings of Americans and British citizens working in Iraq, most of them ending in ghastly and widely publicized killings. Between spring 2004 and spring 2005, more than 200 foreigners were taken captive in Iraq. More than 30 of them were killed by their kidnappers.
What were the rights of man?
In 1789, the French Assembly made the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, meant to flesh out the revolutionary cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Influenced by the U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776, as well as the ideas of the Enlightenment. The document guaranteed religious freedom, the freedom of speech and the press, and personal security. It proclaimed that man has natural and inalienable rights, which include liberty, property, personal security, and resistance to oppression. The Declaration further stipulated that no one may be accused, imprisoned, or held under arrest except in such cases and in such a way as is prescribed by law, and that every man is presumed innocent until he is proved guilty. The Declaration was subsequently written into the preamble of the French Constitution, 1791. However, the Code Napoleon superseded many of the ideas it set forth.
What is the roadmap for peace?
It is a plan for lasting peace in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The roadmap was announced by the Bush administration on March 14, 2003, after several months of working with Russian, European Union, and United Nations, UN officials to develop the plan, which calls for a permanent two-state solution. The roadmap outlines specific, actionable steps to be taken by each side in the conflict. The U.S. State Department described it as a performance-based and goal-driven roadmap, with clear phases, timelines, target dates, and benchmarks aiming at progress through reciprocal steps by the two parties in the political, security, economic, humanitarian, and institution-building fields. In announcing the roadmap, President George W. Bush, 1946, called for an end to the recent wave of violence, Intifada, in the Middle East, for authoritative Palestinian leadership, and for Israeli readiness to comply. He asked for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to contribute to and discuss the roadmap. And he repeated his call for all parties in the Middle East to abandon old hatreds and to meet their responsibilities for peace. The plan, the last phase of which was to have been completed in 2004-05. Foundered amid the daily violence of the Second Intifada, but was given new promise in May 2005 when Palestinian and Israeli leaders met in Egypt to discuss peace.
What was Camp David 2?
In July 2000, President Bill Clinton, 1946, invited Israeli and Palestinian Authority leaders to the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, to hammer out a final peace agreement in the Middle East. In what could have been the major breakthrough in the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, 1942, agreed to a Palestinian state, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the administration of all Jerusalem holy sites by a third party, i.e. neither Israel nor Palestine. In exchange, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, 1929 to 2004, was asked to sign an end of conflict addendum to the final agreement, which would have required him to bring the militant Arab group Hamas under control and end all Palestinian attacks on Israelis. But Arafat refused the deal. The July 11 to 25 meeting ended without an agreement. Violence erupted again in Israel, beginning the Second Intifada.
How old is the British Parliament?
The Legislative Assembly of Great Britain has roots dating back to the Middle Ages. 500-1350, when a great council, known as the Curia Regis, advised the king. This body was made up of nobility and clergy. The body evolved over time and progressively gained more power to govern. Today Parliament consists of the House of Commons, a democratically elected body, roughly equivalent to the U.S. House of Representatives, the House of Lords, which consists of noblemen, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons, as well as high-ranking Anglican clergy, bishops and abbots, and the monarch, king or queen. Since 1911 the power of the House of Lords has been negligible, with the House of Commons charged with electing the Prime Minister, who must be a member of Commons. The Prime Minister, not the monarch, is the executive head of government.
What were the Camp David Accords?
Camp David Accords is the popular name for a 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The name stuck since President Jimmy Carter, 1924, met with Israel's Menachem Begin, 1913 to 1992, and Egypt's Anwar Sadat, 1918 to 1981, at the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland. The treaty was actually signed on March 26, 1979, in Washington, D.C., with Carter as a witness to the agreement between the warring Middle Eastern nations. The pact, which was denounced by Arab countries, provided for the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The mountainous area, adjacent to Israel and at the north end of the Red Sea, had been the site of a major campaign during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and had been occupied by Israel since. The transfer of the peninsula back to Egypt was completed in 1982. The Camp David Accords had also outlined that the two sides would negotiate Palestinian autonomy in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. However, Sadat was assassinated in 1981. And this initiative saw no progress as a result of the Camp David Accords.
What was the Chiapas uprising?
Also called the Zapatista Uprising. It was a January 1994 revolt staged by Mayan rebels in Chiapas, Mexico's southernmost state. On New Year's Day, members of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, AZLN, launched a coordinated attack on 4 municipal capitals and a Mexican army headquarters in the remote region. With the cry of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, the armed insurgents invoked the name and spirit of Emiliano Zapata. 1879 to 1919, Mexico's early 20th century revolutionary leader. The EZLN, or Zapatistas, destroyed government offices, burned land deeds, and freed prisoners. At least 135 people died in the rebellion. On January 12, after 11 days of heavy fighting, a ceasefire was called. The next month peace talks began between EZLN representatives and the Mexican government. Negotiations between the two sides proved to be a frustrating and lengthy process. Seeking democracy, liberty, and justice for all Mexicans. The EZLN called for government reforms, including local autonomy, as well as land redistribution and other measures to aid the region's impoverished indigenous population. In February 1996, the two sides signed the San Andrés Accords and agreed to more talks. But in August of that year, the dialogue stalled. The EZLN said it would not return to the negotiating table until the government implemented the San Andrés Accords. Meanwhile, pro-government paramilitary groups with ties to Mexico's ruling PRI party, Institutional Revolutionary Party, made their presence known in Chiapas. There were violent episodes, the most horrific of which occurred on December 23, 1997, when the pro-government paramilitary group Paz y Justicia, Peace and Justice, brutally attacked a group of unarmed indigenous people in the village of Octeal. A total of 45 people, mostly women and children, were slaughtered, and 25 more were injured. The turbulence in Chiapas is fueled by deep-seated anti-government feelings among the indigenous, Mayan, population. Despite the fact that it is rich in natural resources, including coffee, corn, timber, and oil, it is one of the poorest regions of Latin America. The wealth of Chiapas rests in the hands of a few. In 1990, half of the population in the state was malnourished, 42% had no access to clean water, 33% was without electricity, and 62% did not have a grade school education. It was no coincidence that the 1994 uprising took place the same day that the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect, according to one Zapatista leader. NAFTA was the death sentence for Mexico's poor farmers, who would now have to compete with farmers north of the border. In 2005, more than 10 years after the Zapatistas burst onto the scene, the situation in Chiapas remained unresolved.
Why was Oliver Cromwell important to British history?
English soldier and statesman Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, was a key player in a chain of events that shaped modern British government. The events began when Charles I, 1600 to 1649, House of Stuart, ascended the throne in 1625 and shortly thereafter married a French Catholic princess, immediately raising the ire of his Protestant subjects. This was not the end of England's problems with King Charles. After repeated struggles with the primarily Puritan Parliament, Charles dismissed the legislative body in 1629 and went on to rule without it for 11 years. During this period, religious and civil liberties were seriously diminished, and political and religious strife prevailed. Fearing the king's growing power, Parliament moved to raise an army. And soon civil war broke out, 1642 to 48. Like the French Revolution, 1789 to 99, fought 150 years later. The struggle in England was largely one between a king who claimed to rule by divine right and a government body, in this case Parliament, that claimed the right to govern the nation in behalf of the people. Enter military leader Oliver Cromwell, after 2 years of indecisive battles in the English Civil War. Cromwell led his parliamentary army troops to victories at Marston Moor, 1644, and Naseby, 1645, which resulted in Charles's surrender. But when Charles escaped his captors in 1647, the fighting was briefly renewed. It was ended once and for all in 1648, when the king was tried the following year. Cromwell was among those leading the charge to have Charles executed. The king's opponents had their way and, having abolished the monarchy, soon established the Commonwealth of England, installing Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Though Cromwell endeavoured to bring religious tolerance to England and was somewhat successful in setting up a quasi-democratic government, he declined to take the title of king in 1657. His leadership was constantly challenged by those who wished to restore the Stuart monarchy. When Cromwell died in 1658, he was succeeded by his son, Richard, 1626 to 1712. Whose talents were not up to the challenges put to the Lord Protector. The movement to restore the monarchy, particularly the Stuart line, gained impetus, and Richard Cromwell was soon dismissed and went to live outside of England for the next 20 years. Charles II, 1630 to 1685, the son of Charles I, ascended the throne in 1660. Beginning the 8-year period known as the Restoration. Both Charles and his brother, James II, 1633 to 1701, who succeeded him in 1685. Worked to reassert the absolutism of the Stuart monarchy. But both kings butted heads with Parliament, particularly when it came to financial matters. Finally in 1688, James II was deposed in the so-called Glorious Revolution. William III, 1650 to 1702, grandson of Charles I, and his wife, Queen Mary II. 1662 to 1694, daughter of James II, were placed on the throne the following year. Though the House of Stuart remained in power, there was an important hitch. Parliament compelled William and Mary to accept the Bill of Rights, of 1689, which asserted that the Crown no longer had absolute power in England and that it must rule responsibly through the nation's representatives sitting in Parliament. Thus, the English Civil War, also called the Protestant Revolution, and the influence of Oliver Cromwell and other parliamentarians laid the foundation for England's constitutional monarchy.
How old is guerrilla warfare?
Guerrilla warfare dates back to ancient times but got its name during the Peninsular War of 1809 to 1814 when Napoleon Bonaparte 1769 to 1821, fought for control of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. In Spanish, guerrilla means small war. The resistance to Napoleon's troops employed tactics that are typical of what we know as guerrilla warfare, fighting in small bands, ambushes, sudden raids, and sabotage. It is Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, who, in his 22-year fight against the Chinese nationalists, from 1927 to 1949, is believed to have developed the techniques of modern guerrilla warfare. Chairman Mao slowly but surely gained the support and sympathy of the common people, in particular those living in rural areas. Eventually, he had control of the masses who believed the reforms he would make once in office would be favorable to them. The people would provide the manpower and supplies that would sustain the fight. If any followers faltered in their loyalty to the cause, they would be punished. Today, guerrillas rely on terrorist attacks against governments, goading the military into action, which, in turn, rallies the public in its outrage against government. In this way, guerrilla movements can gain popular support over time. Such movements are by no means limited to the countryside. Urban attacks include tactics such as kidnapping and assassination. Such guerrilla measures have led to the outbreak of civil wars.
Who was Mary, Queen of Scots?
Mary Stuart was born in 1542 to James V of Scotland, who ruled from 1513 to 1542, and his wife, Mary of Guise. When Mary was just 6 days old, Her father died, making the infant a queen. Her mother ruled the country as a regent until 1561, when Mary officially took on her duties. She was, by all reports, a beautiful and charming young woman whose courage and mettle would be tested by time. When she ascended the throne, she inherited her mother's struggle with the Protestants, who were led by John Knox, 1513 to 1572, a former Catholic priest who was involved in the Reformation. As a Roman Catholic, Mary was subject to harsh verbal attacks issued by Knox, who denounced the Pope's authority and the practices of the Church. But this was not the worst of her troubles. In 1565 Mary wed her English cousin, Lord Darnley, 1545 to 1567, in an attempt to secure her claim to the English throne as successor to Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, also her cousin. But Mary's ambitions would be her undoing. She quickly grew to dislike her husband, who became aligned with her Protestant opponents and successfully carried out a plot to murder in her presence Mary's advisor, David Rizzio, c. 1533 to 1566. Surprisingly, Mary and Darnley reconciled shortly thereafter, a politically savvy move on her part, and she conceived a child, James, who was born in 1566. Darnley had enemies of his own, and 1 year later he was murdered. Mary promptly married the Earl of Bothwell, 1536 to 1578, with whom she had fallen in love well before becoming a widow. Bothwell was accused of Darnley's murder, and though he was acquitted, his marriage to the Queen shocked Scotland. The people took up arms, forcing Mary to abdicate the throne in 1567. She was 25 years old. Fleeing to England, Mary, Queen of Scots, was given refuge by Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. Though she was technically a prisoner, Mary nevertheless was able to conspire with Elizabeth's enemies, including English Catholics and the Spanish, in attempts to kill her. When one such plot was discovered in 1586, Mary was charged for her involvement in it and was put on trial. Found guilty, she was put to death in 1587, though Elizabeth hesitated to take such action. Meantime, Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, 1566 to 1625, had taken on his responsibilities in 1583 after Scotland had been ruled on his behalf by regents since Mary's abdication some 16 years prior. He had promptly formed an alliance with Elizabeth I and, in 1587, accepted with resignation his mother's execution. In 1603 James succeeded Elizabeth, becoming James I, King of England, uniting Scotland and England under one throne. The union was made official about a century later, in 1707, when Parliament passed the Act of Union.
Why was Constantine I called the Great?
Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, c. 275 to 337, is credited with no less than beginning a new era in history. His father, Constantius, was ruler of the Roman Empire when he died in 306. Though Constantine was named emperor by Roman soldiers, a power struggle ensued. During a battle near Rome in 312, Constantine, who had always been sympathetic toward Christians, reportedly saw a vision of a flaming cross. He emerged from the conflict both converted and victorious. For the next 12 years, Constantine ruled the West Roman Empire while Licinius, also tolerant to Christians, ruled the East. But a struggle between the two emperors ended in death for Licinius and, beginning in 325, Constantine ruled as sole emperor. During Constantine's reign, Christians regained freedom of worship and the Christian Church became legal. In 325 he convened the Council of Nicaea, from whence came the Nicene Creed so familiar to Christians today. In moving the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, in 330, Constantine shifted the empire's focus from west to east and in so doing laid the foundation for the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Orthodox Church regards Constantine as a saint.
What happened in Granada?
On October 24, 1983, about 3,000 U.S. Marines and U.S. Army Rangers landed on the Caribbean island. The number included about 300 military personnel from neighboring Antigua, Barbados, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. The arrival followed the October 12 through 19 coup in which Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, 1943 to 1983, was overthrown and killed by a hardline Marxist military council headed by General Hudson Austin. While the United Nations and Friends of the United States condemned President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, for the action, American troops detained General Austin and restored order on the island. Governor-General Sir Paul Scoon, 1935, formed an interim government to prepare for elections. Most of the U.S. military presence was withdrawn by December 1983, with nominal forces remaining on the island through most of 1985. President Reagan justified the tactic by citing that the coup had put in danger American students on the island. But prevailing political conditions on tiny Grenada were more likely to have inspired the show of force. Increasingly stronger ties between Grenada and Cuba had made many American officials nervous. They feared the island would be used as a way station for shipping Soviet and Cuban arms to Central America.
What was the Act of Settlement?
The 1701 decree reiterated the Bill of Rights of 1689 by stating that the King or Queen of England must not be a Roman Catholic and must also not be married to a Roman Catholic. The Act of Settlement further stipulated that the sovereign must be a member of the Protestant Church of England. The measure was passed by Parliament, in part due to fear of the Jacobites. Supporters of the Stuart king, James II, 1633–1701, who had been exiled in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution. The Jacobites, not to be confused with the French Jacobins. The political party that came to power during the French Revolution, sought to keep the House of Stuart in power. Due to the line of succession, however, the Act of Settlement did not take effect until 1714, when Queen Anne 1665–1714, died and left no successors to the throne. She was the last Stuart ruler of England.
Did Marie Antoinette really say, "Let them eat cake"?
No, the widely quoted phrase was incorrectly attributed to her, and the entire story was probably made up. Nevertheless, the legend is not far from fact, as the daughter of a Holy Roman Emperor, Francis I, the beautiful Marie Antoinette, 1755–1793, was accustomed to a life of luxury. Unhappy in her marriage to Louis XVI, 1754–1793, King of France, she pursued her own pleasurable interests with abandon. Despite the economic problems that plagued France at the time, she lived an extravagant lifestyle, which included grand balls, a small palace at Versailles, theatre, gambling, and other frivolities. She was completely disinterested in the affairs of the nation. Many French people blamed her for corruption in the court. In short, she did much to earn herself the terrible reputation that has followed her through history. Unpopular in her own day, one of the stories that circulated about her had Marie Antoinette asking an official why the Parisians were angry. When he explained to the queen that it was because the people had no bread, she replied, "Then let them eat cake." The French Revolution, which began in 1789, soon put an end to Marie Antoinette's excesses. Along with her husband, she was put to death by guillotine in 1793.
What was the Dirty War?
This is the name that has been given to a troubling chapter in Mexico's recent history. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, thousands of left-wing reformists were killed in Mexico, and hundreds more went missing and are presumed to have been killed. After the 2000 election of reform-minded President Vicente Fox, 1942, the human rights abuses of Mexico's Dirty War era at last were being investigated. In June 2002, secret security files were released detailing the government's iron-fisted crackdown on its opponents during the late 1960s and into the 1970s. In July 2002, former Mexican President Luis Echeverría, 1922, was called before a special prosecutor, who quizzed the octogenarian about two massacres that occurred when he was a high-ranking government official and then president. In the two events, one in 1968 and the other in 1971, anti-government protesters were beaten and shot. Echevarria and his presidential successor, José López Portillo, 1920–2004. Both denied any involvement in the events or in the disappearance of radicals who actively protested their regimes. In late February 2005, Mexico's Supreme Court, citing a 30-year time limit, ruled that Echevarria could not be tried on alleged human rights abuses. The decision was considered a setback for Fox's reform efforts, which centered on punishing past crimes. But the special prosecutor in the case did not rule out bringing other charges against Echevarria, saying the former president ordered men loyal to him to attack student demonstrators.